Wait another 30 seconds or so before we start. Community call. Reminder for everyone to put their name and company affiliation into the meeting minutes. And this morning we have a lightning talk scheduled about Project Valhalla, value types by Toby. Toby, I think you could take over the screen share. Start your presentation when you're ready.
Can you see my screen? Everything good?
Yeah, looks good.
All right. Okay. So today I'll be talking about inline types. So brief introduction, I'm Toby. I work for the OpenJ9 VM team. So today, the goal of today's talk is to talk about the challenges with the Java type system. More specifically, why the type system does not allow us to get the best out of hardware. And then I'll introduce inline types and show how it's going to solve these problems. So the last presentation I did, I talked about the issue with references and how in the JVM there are a lot of references. There's a lot of pointer chasing, which increases the likelihood of cache misses. I also described how out-of-line arrays are really inefficient because you have a lot of headers and you'll have a lot of references, and it doesn't benefit from modern hardware optimizations such as prefetching, in addition to increasing the likelihood of cache misses. And just to the sheer number of headers and references, there's a lot of bloat in the heap, which makes for a very inefficient use of memory. And so all of these things are detrimental to performance. So one of the great things about the Java language is identity. Identity is useful because it allows you to keep track of state. In Java, every object has identity, so even if its state mutates, it still remains the same object. This feature is very appealing for software developers, which is why object-oriented languages like Java have become very popular. In Java, you can perform identity operations like a query monitor on any object. The problem is that there are some cases where you may not need identity, as the value will not mutate in its lifetime, or in cases where you're simply using an object as a data carrier. In these cases, you don't really need identity, but you still have to pay the cost of identity. So in order to deal with identity, you need references. In order to maintain a single view of an object state, you need to have a reference to that object so that everyone refers to the same thing. When an object is pushed on the stack, it's a reference to that object that's pushed on the stack. If an object has object fields, then you get more references. And for things like hash tables, which contain an object array, there are even more references. Each entry in the array is a reference. And this is why we ended up with this picture last time. So you can see that references make up a large proportion of the Java use footprint. And this is all because of identity. So we need a solution. And the solution is inline types. Inline types are essentially objects that behave like primitives. Hence the tagline, codes like a class, works like an int. The important part here is works like an int, specifically the performance aspects of an int. Inline types are formally called value types. It's the same thing. So just as a disclaimer, everything that I will describe in this presentation describes the current state of inline types. this feature is still under design, so everything is subject to change. So the main characteristics of inline types are that they are identityless, immutable, and flattenable. Identityless means that an instance of an inline type which has the same contents is indistinguishable from all other inline types with the same contents. Essentially what this means is that if it looks the same in memory, it's the same thing. As a result, identity operations like locking are disallowed. Immutability means that an instance of an inline type will not change once it's been created. If you want to change the value, you have to make a new one with a different value. And flattenable means that the JVM is free to embed or inline an inline type within its container. And flattening, it's called flattenable, not flattened, because it's not guaranteed that it will be flattened. However, the JVM will try to flatten when it deems it beneficial for performance. So as you can see, it has a lot of the same characteristics as primitive types. Primitive types don't have identity, they are immutable, and they're essentially flattened. You never have references to a primitive. You're always just dealing with the primitive value in itself. So you can kind of think of inline types as user-defined primitives. But as you'll see later, they can do a lot more than what your typical primitives can do. So here's a little example. If we define a point with two fields, this is just a regular reference class, and we define line with 2-point fields, you get the layout as you see on the left. And as expected, we have references to the 2-point fields. But if point is converted to an inline type, then it looks more like this. So this is a much better memory layout, and it's better for performance. And the only thing that changed was the inline keyword in the definition of points. So using inline types is very simple. It's going to be very familiar for Java developers. So we already know that inline types are identityless, immutable, and flattenable. But aside from that, they're a lot like regular classes, meaning that they can define methods. Unlike primitive types, primitives need to be boxed to their object counterparts in order to call methods on them. Inline types don't need to do this sort of dance. They can define methods themselves. They can implement interfaces. They can implement abstract classes with restrictions. And they can, since they're a subclass of Java objects, they support the Java object API, like equals and toStrings. But there's going to be some difference in the behavior of those APIs because of the characteristics of inline types. So inline types are great because you can essentially define aggregates, data aggregates that the JVM can easily optimize. However, there are some trade-offs using inline types. You get improved performance, but by definition, you have to give up some functionality. The characteristics of inline types is that it's identity-less, immutable. These are restrictions. Identity enables you to do things. Identity-less does not allow you to do certain things. Mutability enables you to do things, and immutability restricts you from doing things. So essentially, you are restricting what you can do with inline types, but this is the reason why they can perform better. So some of the restrictions are that inline types cannot be subclassed, since inline types may be flattened. A subclass of an inline type could add fields, meaning that the inline type would have a variable storage size. So this is why you can't subclass them. Since inline types are identityless, you can't perform any identity operations on it, like waiting or notifying or synchronizing. It doesn't implement clonable, because cloning is essentially inconsequential. It's kind of like trying to clone a primitive. It can't be an enum, because enums can contain identity, and they do have mutable fields. They cannot define finalizers, because this mechanism is related to identity. Um, Essentially, there is no lifetime for identityless objects. Um, so, the finalization mechanism doesn't really work. Also, inline types can subclass abstract types, but only if the abstract type does not have any fields. So these are, the the main restrictions. Um, so as previously said, inline types are flattenable. Um, the properties of flattenability are that the field can never be null. Um, if a field is flattened, there's no way to represent null since all the bits are used up for the data. So inline types are not nullable. Inline types also cannot have fields that refer to themselves either directly or indirectly, because it's impossible to calculate the layout of a circular type if it's flattened. This is something that you can do with regular reference types, but you can't do with inline types. And when loading a type that contains inline types, you actually have to preload the inline types in order to calculate the size of them, so that when you are allocating storage for your type, you know exactly how big your flattened fields are. And ultimately, flattening is a JVM decision, so it's kind of like a JVM hint. You're never really guaranteed that it will be flattened. So here is the Java hierarchy. So at the top we have Java-lang object, and all inline types subclass object, kind of like references today. And inline types can also implement interfaces. So inline types work well with the existing Java system. Off to the other side of primitives, there's a line separating them because primitives really can't participate as well as regular classes. So as I said earlier, you often have to box primitives in order to use them with a lot of APIs. So that's one of the drawbacks of primitives. But with inline types, you get the primitive performance and more usability. So that's the benefit of inline types. So two new bytecodes are introduced for inline types. Bytecodes are essentially machine instructions for the JVM. So the first is default value, which creates a new inline type with fields set to 0. So it's similar to the new bytecode, except that it doesn't require an init. As soon as you create an inline type, it's already initialized. The default values for when using default value are 0 for primitives and null for references. With field takes an inline type and creates a new one with an updated field. So this is similar to put field, except there's no mutation because you're getting a new version with an updated field. And then here are some of the other bytecode changes required for inline types. So these are existing bytecodes, but their semantics are different for inline types. The acomp bytecodes no longer perform reference comparisons. Because inline types are identityless, if you have two different references to inline types with the same contents, the result of the acomp has to be true. So for this reason, if acomp needs to be able to detect when it's referring to an inline type, and if that's the case, then a field-wise comparison needs to be performed instead, rather than a simple, are these references the same or not? The AA store bytecode, this is the bytecode that writes into arrays. If a null is written into an array of inline types, then a null pointer exception is thrown because inline type arrays can never contain null. Because inline types don't have identity, the monitor enter exit bytecodes will always throw legal monitor stay exception. And the check cast bytecode will throw a null pointer exception if you try to cast null to an inline type. So those are essentially the high-level details. There's a lot more, but given the time we have, I think those are sufficient for now. So now we'll look at a few little examples. These examples show what it's like to use inline types and some of the corner cases that might not be immediately obvious to users. So in this example, point is the reference type. So it's a reference type array. So you create an array of points with 3 elements. Each of those elements are null. But if point is an inline type, as soon as you create it, your elements, because inline types are not nullable, you actually have valid non-null entries in your array. So if you have code that does something like this, where you're testing to see if it's null, the logic is a little different if it's an inline type. And this might be surprising to users. Here's another example. There's some APIs out there that accept top types like Java object or Java object array. Since all references today are nullable, a lot of the APIs will assume that anything that subclasses object is also nullable. But once inline types are introduced, you might get these surprise null pointer exceptions because the type you're dealing with actually isn't nullable. And the same issues can occur with identity operations. So to summarize, with inline types, there are fewer indirections. We get inline object arrays and flattenable fields. And this solves a lot of the memory layout issues that were discussed earlier, and makes it easier for the JVM to optimally it makes it easier for the JVM to optimize performance, which means that it makes it easier for users to write more performant code. So to summarize, inline types enables users to get better performance out of their hardware. So that was a pretty brief overview. I'll write a blog with more details. I think I'm out of time, so I'll take any quick questions now if there are any.
You mentioned that flattening the objects is a JVM hint. Are there times when OpenJ9 wouldn't do the flattening?
There are cases where if the type is too large, it might not be beneficial to flatten it. And in cases where you have too many flattenable fields and you can't find a storage container big enough to house a container, then in those cases it might also be better to not flatten.
Do you know if there's any timeline for when this will show up in a Java version?
Honestly, I can't say with any certainty. I think we're getting closer to that date, but certainly not this year. I doubt it will come out in the 16 timeframe.
Okay. Thanks, Toby.
Thanks.
Okay, looking back at our schedule, um, I noticed that there's a list of upcoming Lightning talks, and one of them is GitHub Action running AQA tests, which we just did.
Yeah, that one's complete. I guess we need to update the minutes here.
Yeah, I'll just delete that. So I don't see any dates for any upcoming talks, but hopefully we'll get some scheduled. If anybody has any other suggestions for topics, you can let me know or just add them to the minutes. So next up is looking at the end user issues. So a couple came in through Adopt last night. Windows 32-bit is not built to be large address aware, so I think I have a fix for that one, which I'll test out today. We'll also see if OpenJDK wants to take that change. Windows JDK 14 and Java 8 cannot exist if they're both on the path. So we haven't investigated that yet. I imagine it's finding a DLL it shouldn't on the path, so we'll have to figure out what's going on there. But since all the DLLs have the same names, no matter what version of Java you're running, I'm not sure that we'll be able to do much, but we'll at least see what's going wrong. Somebody else found a problem with using OpenSSL. Problem is that the problem seems to have disappeared. They were able to duplicate it at first, and then they tried to write a small test case to duplicate it, and after that they could never reproduce it again. So I'm not sure what we can do there. Crash in fast JIT new object. So somebody found a crash in the JIT on Xlinux. They weren't able to reproduce it, but there is a core file. I don't know if that's useful for somebody to take a look at. So it's assigned to the JIT in the current milestone. But obviously we can defer that or close it if it can't be reproduced. And segmentation fault, VM state 0. Seemed to be a problem with AOT code, because if no AOT was enabled, then the problem went away. And the last I saw, Erwin was asking for more diagnostics using an XAOT option, but I don't think that had been responded to. So we're waiting for a response there. So that's it in the last week. If anybody has any comments or questions or anything to say, otherwise we'll move on. Reminder to add help wanted and beginner tags to the issues appropriate for those as we try to get new people involved in the project. And then we're looking at our download stats. Andrew, any updates for download stats? Let's see who's on our call. I don't see Andrew on the call. Okay, so we'll assume the download stats have not been updated and move on. So a reminder that we should advertise our milestone builds and our next milestone. So we are branching for the 021 release this weekend, assuming everything looks good. We had a couple of regressions happen, one on Friday and one on Monday, but I think those are under control to be resolved this week. So hopefully we're looking in good shape on the weekend to do our code split. And immediately following the code split, we'll start our milestone 1 builds next week. Anybody have questions about the 021 release? There are many issues in the milestone plan. We whittled it down a bit yesterday. I think there's something like 42 issues left, many assigned to JIT, many assigned to VM. So hopefully those are being progressed, and we'd like to get as many resolved this week as we can before milestone 1. Milestone 2 scheduled for June 29th. Again, we do the tagging on the weekend, assuming the weekend builds look good, and start our milestone 2 builds on the Monday to be released as soon as they're done. And then, since we're branching this weekend, any fixes that want to go into the release after this weekend will have to be double delivered. And then after milestone 2, we'll be a lot pickier about what can go in to the release. This will be getting much closer to the actual release, expecting the updates, I think, on the 14th from OpenJDK, and then we'll do our sniff testing, make sure everything looks good, and our final builds after that. So that takes us to adopt update. Oh, I see our anteater is busily typing.
Can someone finish those minutes, please? So the notes I was adding here, as you've seen at the OpenJ9 project, we have rolled out some of the smart parallelization stuff. We'll be continuing that rollout at both Adopt and OpenJ9 projects. So The Sanity external, extended external, special external stuff is in process. There are some changes to those in terms of other parameters. So the Sanity and extended external testing, which includes application functional tests and microprofile TCKs, those get triggered or should get triggered off of the nightly build pipelines. But in that case, we should reference the actual nightly build. So we need to map to use the nightly build that's downloaded onto the slave machine. In the case of testing that we want to trigger from the publishing of Docker images to test the actual images, where we'll reference the JDK that's in the image, that will be the special external set, and it'll include functional and system tests running inside the container. And those we actually shouldn't launch off of a nightly pipeline because that is unrelated to how the Docker images are published. So we have a PR open at the OpenJDK Docker repo because right now the way Docker images are published out of this project, it's very opaque. It is unclear and there's no console output even that says what gets published, what gets built and published. It's not everything. So in order to test in a smart way, we need to create some sort of trail or be able to transparently see what gets updated. So we've added a script that's going to create an artifact that lists what got published and what new labels are have been changed. And that way we'll be able to trigger that special external testing off of that run. It will also tell us how old a particular Docker image is, so we can tune it to say if something is less than 24 hours old, then trigger testing. And then I haven't, if Stuart's on the line and wants to do any update relating to the risk, so I guess he can.
Nothing particularly extra to add on the RISC-V stuff. We're still waiting for the system we have to be reinstalled with Debian, and yeah, some of the test script updates to be done to let us run through a full test of that. So yeah.
And if you want to connect on the test changes, that'll be great. We'll be trying to run the tests on the actual machine, I presume.
Once it's up and running, yes. At the moment, it will run on a virtual machine.
Later. Okay. Thanks. That's it.
Okay, thank you. For those who weren't paying attention, we did enable Sanity functional and extended functional at OpenJ9. So if you're running PR builds or waiting for ORMAR acceptance and there's enough machines, hopefully those builds are running a bit faster. In the case where all the machines are being used, they might be slightly slower, but such is life.
Yeah, and if you wanted, in terms of a lightning talk, to have an overview in this call, I'm sure Lan and Renfe would be happy to do it, just for the sake of committers understanding what it means.
Sure. Okay, I think that takes us to machines. Do you have anybody on to talk about our machines?
Joe's online. I mean, other than we had an outage for all of our AIX systems on Monday. While the machines came back up pretty quickly, I guess there's a lot of the core infrastructure still is not at 100%. So our network performance is very, very poor to these machines. SDK uploads and downloads are taking, I believe someone had reported earlier today, upwards of an hour to pull from Artifactory. So it's where normally it's like 2 minutes. So there's a few of us that are on the email chain with the folks that supply these machines to us, and we're just waiting for the an update from them so we can recycle these systems and hopefully see our performance returned.
So that's not new. Downloading AIX JVMs was taking a really long time weeks ago. Didn't happen just since Monday.
I was not aware of that. When we first brought the systems online, what was it, a month or 2 months ago, they were comparable. Well, I guess they were comparable to the old systems, but I don't remember what those times were like. I was sure they were in the 2-minute time frame, though.
Yeah, so I don't know when it changed, but I think for a while we were having problems downloading JVMs from Artifactory. We were getting timeouts, and I was looking at builds, and I had noticed at that time that AX was extremely slow. So we're probably back to where we were before Monday.
Okay.
Not back to the original times. It doesn't seem to be impacting our nightly builds. And if it's always been like this for some time, it's probably not any change for PR builds either.
Well, it's still if it's taking an hour, that's a problem. But I guess as soon as they come back to us and they say everything is fine again, then we'll recycle everything and make sure and do some testing. I know Adam was doing some benchmarking and trying to try doing some comparisons with other platforms. So I mean, if it takes 5 minutes, I'm sort of okay with that, but not an hour.
Yeah, I agree. An hour's pretty slow. It'd be nice.
Way too much.
Be nice to have it faster.
Right. Okay. And as far as I know, that was the only bit of machine side we have.
Yeah, when they first came back, they were about 10K a second, and now they're about 100. But once they say that they're 100%, then we can see what those numbers are, and we can compare to the. I'm sure I have it in an issue somewhere where the numbers were original, so I can compare. And if it's not good, then we can. At least we have their attention on the email, so we can keep going with that.
Okay. Peter, anything you want to say about the website?
Sorry, I was on mute. It's down to Sue at the minute to get some things going, and she's rather busy this week, so slightly delayed, but it will happen.
Okay. We'll look forward to seeing the new website go live. And then that brings us to any other business, but I see we have some things. CMake, Devin?
Yeah, so we successfully had the switch over of the JDK 11 to default to CMake for OS X. Next platform up is Xlinux, and I'm kind of shooting for the end of next week, so like the 12th.
Sounds good. Should we enable more testing then for Xlinux?
Yeah, so I'm gonna look at that, probably open up some issues for testing and PRs, whatnot, today sometime.
Okay, sounds good. I don't know if Mark's on. I don't see Mark. I haven't heard anything about the release proposal. Apparently we're aiming for August, so I guess we have some time. Does anybody know? Shelley, have you heard anything more about the interim release proposal at Adopt?
No, I presume that Mark still needs to create the TSC issue officially. We had talked about it. People are supportive in theory, but I'm not sure that there's an actual TSC issue to request it.
Yeah, there was no request from OpenJ9 for this. We discussed it potentially in the context of some other things we were going to have to do. So yes, we could definitely do with a request from OpenJ9. The gating thing when we discussed it last time was build stability, and we have had quite a lot of problems with that in the last couple of weeks, which may be problematic in terms of being able to get more regular releases out, because it's requiring quite a lot of work to keep the build stable at the moment.
Yeah, I think the discussion had gone to, we want to harden up the release process even further at the project I created a TSE issue 158 where I want to define all of the extra bits, because right now we have a fine release document that probably needs to be simplified even further. But that still only talks about the creation, mainly talks about the creation of the JDK and JRE packages. We also need the same for Docker images and installers, and simplify each of those down to less than a few steps.
Yeah, the Docker one in particular, because it's not part of the main pipelines, needs to be added. I think I have a work item kicking around somewhere for that to be documented, but I don't think it's been actioned yet.
Yeah, so I got some documentation out of Dina Carr in an issue at Docker repo, so I have learned some things, but yeah, that's still outstanding.
Okay. Can you ping me that link?
Will do.
Cheers.
So even though Mark suggested August, I suppose Adopt could push back and say August is not appropriate and suggest some other time when it could start.
Yeah, but for sure he should create the issue so that it's a real request. We do have, as Stuart said, other examples where we would likely want to be able to do interim releases unrelated to OpenJ9, but having several reasons to do this is better than having only one.
Okay. So there's the K8 helm and operator discussion. I don't know if anybody's on to say anything about that. I haven't seen anything new in the issue lately. And then microjit. I don't know if you wanted to say anything, Scott.
So microjit issue. We recently had an update on the PR from another review from Keith Campbell with some changes pushed up, if anyone wants to take a look. Andrew Craig, if he's on, I remember him previously saying that we should have some sort of a in-depth meeting interest group. We put a sign-up thing, or at least I did, below this item in the Hangout agenda. So if you're interested in that, please please put your name in the list there, and let myself or Andrew Craig know about it.
Yeah, I'm a bit slow getting that organized, but yes, I will get one organized, and we'll advertise it on the Slack channels as well.
Thank you.
Okay, does anybody have any other business to discuss today? Going once, going twice.
I did have a quick unrelated question. Does anybody know when the next Aquavit meeting is?
Next Wednesday.
Next Wednesday, okay. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everybody. We did record this, and we'll make the recording available on YouTube as usual.
Thank you. Bye.